fuels and preventing decarbonization or net zero transitions to find a point of entry into mainstream publics in order to land their worldview. On that basis, we have seen argumentation which suggests that everything from the idea that Putin was in fact emboldened to invade Ukraine because of the West's fixation on net zero agendas, and that it is our obsession with the Paris Agreement and climate accords that is allowing conflicts like this to occur. Of course, the conflict itself has also caused a number of supply chain issues and energy crises around the world, and the fallout of that conflict continues to be seen not just in the Anglosphere, in Europe and North America, but also in regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and MENA. And once again, there has been an incredible effort by anti-climate and disinformation actors to frame that situation as the fault of green levies and other net zero policies. So rather than saying, you know, we should have pivoted to renewable infrastructure a decade ago and we then would not have had this kind of reliance on oil and gas, instead, what you are seeing breaking through and becoming the dominant narrative in a number of geographies and contexts is it's because of green levies, it's because of heat pump subsidies, it's because of our net zero targets for 2030 and beyond that we are currently in the cost of living crisis. And the further kind of extension of that argument is that as a result, the climate agenda is dead, that people can't afford it, that it's going to bankrupt hardworking people, and that as a result, it is essential at this point in time and for the foreseeable future that we maintain reliance on polluting technologies like oil and gas. On top of that, we have also seen, as Jake mentioned, and it comes up very clearly in the survey results from this report, a resurgence of climate denial. And I think for the coalition, this has been extremely concerning and in some ways surprising, because until this year, denialism was still existing, but it had been pushed more to the periphery. And instead, we were seeing delayism or other, subtler forms of disinformation being at the top of high traction content online. We are now seeing that denial, out and out denial, is making an absolute comeback. And if you, at the moment, go onto Twitter and do an organic search in the search bar of the platform for climate, the first result that is returned is hashtag climate scam, followed by hashtag climate crisis and hashtag climate emergency. But nonetheless, the first of the top three is climate scam. And that is indicative of a broader trend across all of the mainstream platforms, which is that accounts, high traction, almost always verified accounts, feel emboldened to use that kind of language and to frame it in a broader anti-elitist or anti-elitism and particularly anti-institutional frame, using institutions like the World Economic Forum as well as others to kind of mobilize outrage and convince the public that climate action as a whole is a divisive agenda that aims to subjugate normal people. And the final one I wanted to mention is around a real renewed energy and investment in fossil fuel greenwashing and a new brand of greenwashing that we are branding as woke washing, which is essentially the co-option of language from progressive agendas to thwart climate action. So we see this happening both in state-sponsored campaigns, but also being pushed very heavily by the fossil fuel lobby. And we've seen, the presence of lobbyists, over 650 that Global Witness have tracked here at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And in particular, the African gas lobby has been very vocal in making the suggestion that net zero transitions are a form of neo-colonialism or Western imperialism, and that maintenance of fossil fuels is essential for human rights. So it's using the kind of language that you will have seen from the Green movement to make the exact opposite argument against the articles of the Paris Agreement and the ultimate ambitions of global climate action. And that is being done organically via social media. It's being done by people on the ground here in Sharm el-Sheikh, but it is also being done through millions and millions of pounds of investment via ad tech products and services. And there are a recent report out by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate, as well as our partners at the University of Exeter, that show both big oil and carbon major companies themselves, but also front and lobby groups for associations like the American Petroleum Institute continue to put out hundreds of adverts, sometimes as many as 850 adverts running in tandem on a given day, which are achieving tens of millions of impressions that aim to confuse the public about what viable solutions are going forward, and above all, try to create the impression that companies whose investment portfolios are almost entirely grounded in oil and gas are somehow climate champions and are going to lead the charge on a net zero transition. So we have all of these things happening in tandem, and that is the kind of information environment that produces the results found in this survey. And I'm going to pass over to Harriet with what can we do about this?
Thank you, Jenny, and thank you, Jake, for outlining the problems that we're facing. So I'm Harriet Kingerby from ACT Climate Labs. I'm also the co-chair of the Conscious Advertising Network alongside Jake. And the problems that we have outlined today may sound extremely complicated. Climate disinformation is a global problem. It is a huge problem for those of us who are supportive of and working towards the kind of climate action that we need extremely rapidly now. We have created an open letter with a series of asks that we think can play a huge role in solving this big complicated problem. And this accompanies the report that you will find today. So the letter itself calls for the adoption of a universal definition of climate myths and disinformation. It expands the current, the current definitions used by people like Google, for example, which just focus on the scientific consensus that climate change is happening. It is man-made. So this definition has three pillars. The first pillar is looks at content which is actually kind of counter to the scientific consensus around the existence and the impact of climate change and the need for rapid human action as set out in the Paris Climate Agreement. The second pillar of this definition looks at the misrepresentation of science, and this includes things such as emissions and cherry picking. And, these kind of narratives are the ones which erode trust in scientific institutions and the institutions that are going to solve this problem. And the third pillar is around false solutions. So these may be things such as technological fixes, which are talked about or advertised with the intention of suggesting that they could actually take us on course to, the kind of emissions cuts that we need. But in fact, when put under the microscope, do not do so. And this letter is addressed to the COP27 Presidency, the country delegations, and the UNFCCC, as well as the CEOs of major tech platforms. And the reason that we've done this is that we actually believe that if we can have wording that acknowledges the threat of climate mis and disinformation and defines it in the final COP wording, then we can create a cascade effect which will essentially incentivize the tech platforms to embed this within their policy definitions. The tech platforms and social media as well is one of the places where these narratives are amplified and are shared and even have advertising tools attached to them in order to increase that amplification. It is incredibly important that we get a handle on this monetized content. So we are not alone in asking for these kind of outcomes. Over 400 people across the worlds of business, NGOs, and climate leadership have also signed this open letter. They include, from the business side of things, Patagonia, SSE, Ben & Jerry's, Sky, and Havas Media. From an NGO perspective, we have a global coalition of people from Code for Africa, PowerShift Africa, Friends of the Earth, WWF, and Avaz. And from a climate leadership front, we have people such as one of the key architects of the Paris Climate Agreement, Laurence Toubiana, the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, Christiana Figueres, Nobel Prize-winning scientist Bill Hare, and the former Environment Minister of Peru, COP20 President, and current global leader of climate and energy at WWF, Manuel Pulgar Vidal. Platforms themselves have asked us for this kind of guidance. They have no desire to be the arbiters of truth. And they are looking to experts, to trusted bodies such as the UN, to help them to develop policies that can get a handle on this. We have seen great progress. So last year at COP26, Google announced a policy which covers the monetization of climate mis and disinformation as per Pillar 1 of this definition. And later on in the year, Pinterest rolled out a policy which is far more wide-ranging. Some of you might ask yourselves why advertising and why monetized content is so important. And that is because essentially advertising tools can help target this kind of mis and disinformation at members of the population who are most vulnerable to it, and therefore essentially increase the number of people that believe it. But I think it is really important for us to think about how we can also get ahead of this kind of mis and disinformation. Because many of the techniques that are currently employed look at rebutting it and look at kind of solving the problem actually once it has started. We believe also that we need to get ahead. So at ACT Climate Labs, we're looking at how we can actually supercharge the effectiveness of climate communications by embracing things like advertising tools. Because we believe that things like this report show the enormous gap in climate literacy between the people who are at this conference and actually, the populations out there that are going to, public mandates are so important for us to get the kind of policy that we need through. So, we believe that we need to rethink our connection to communications and really, really kind of change the way that we do that over the coming years in order to solve this problem. So I would just like to leave you with a final thought as we started this panel, which is that climate mis and disinformation are a huge threat to everything that we are trying to achieve here today at this conference, and that we must get a handle on them as quickly as possible.
Thanks very much, Harriet, Jenny and Jake. All of the different things we've spoken about just there, for those of you in the room, we do have some information leaflets we've handed out which have the details there. Anyone watching online, you can access both the reports and the open letter, as well as the bulletins at caad.info, that's caad.info. But we do have some time now if anyone would like to ask any questions in the room.
You mentioned that there's a recent resurgence, and it sounds like it's linked with a couple of things, COVID, the Ukraine war. So they're preying on people's fears, which is just evil. But sorry, my question is there a way to track this over time? You mentioned some numbers about the number of people with certain beliefs. Does the report do that? Can you look back 10 years and see a difference in those types of numbers? Or
the short answer is no. This is a conversation that wasn't really happening in the tech space a couple of years ago, even though we can chart back to the 70s and 80s where, if you've watched Big Oil versus the World, on the BBC, for example, those disinformation narratives were sown across mainstream media back then to thwart climate action. In terms of studies that track this sort of level of misinformation in net zero, in renewables and so on, no. And also the tools in order to track misinformation narratives across platforms and into the media are now a lot better, so we can do that. So our intention would be to repeat this work each year to be able to understand what the trajectory is. I have to say we were sort of quite surprised by the numbers on denial, and Jenny sort of talked about that. The work that Jenny and the intelligence unit and the CAD coalition has been doing has been looking at delay narratives. So we were quite surprised at the highest level of 23% being just outright denial in the US. And that gap from what the 99.9% of scientists tell us, and only 77% of Americans believe that climate is even partly caused by human actions, is a stark gap to close if we are going to have success in delivering climate action. So we intend to track it over time, but there hasn't been that sort of level of data up to this point, I don't believe.
Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I would also add on that point that some of these trends, they won't have longitudinal data because they're very recent. If you look at the confluence of conspiracy theories and this sort of amorphous blob of conspiracies that have many different dimensions to them, that is in a number of ways a very new phenomenon, a very recent phenomenon of social media. And if you were talking 10 or 15 years ago, that would not have been part of the information landscape or the way that the public engaged with the topic of climate change at all. The decentralization of information and the gatekeepers of information, or who people now trust, has been a gradual decline over the last decade, and it's tracked in things like Edelman's Trust Barometer that shows historic lows in terms of people's trust in institutions writ large, governments, scientists, universities, etc. But the crossover between something like climate denial and QAnon or transphobia or pushback on the Black Lives Matter movement, that is the opportunism of climate denial. And I think that's one of the things I would really like to emphasize about disinformation, is that it is opportunist. And that's why we've seen such a resurgence around events like the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not necessarily because there's a direct climate link, it's more because it's an opportunity to piggyback on a high news cycle event and to make sure that those ideas are laundered into the mainstream and become normalized with a mainstream audience.
Could I just pick up on a point which I think links both of these two things as well, which is that there are perverse incentives for creating mis and disinformation. So Jake talked about the fact that mis and disinformation has a funding model through advertising. So, for example, if you see a piece of disinformative content and it has ads served before it or around it, then those ads are inadvertently funding the creator of that. And when you then combine, that with social media, now if you think about some of the recommendation algorithms out there, they prioritize content that gets engagement, that gets interaction, and those will be amplified. So what you have is this kind of mixture of this advertising funded kind of model, and then this amplification that happens through social media, which is why we think like that focus on monetized content is so important, because then you effectively cut off the funding model and reduce the number of perverse incentives to produce this kind of stuff.
Do we have any other questions from the floor?
Hi, Katie Collins from CNET. This might be a bit of a predictable question, but obviously we're seeing a lot of turmoil at Twitter at the moment. And, you mentioned Twitter as an example of somewhere where it's easy to come across this. How easy is it to work with the tech platforms, Twitter specifically right now? But, I'd be just curious to know more about that.
Maybe I'll take that. So it's worth saying up front that Twitter have not changed any content moderation policies as it stands. So their content moderation policies remain. However, it begs the question that if you lose your head of trust and safety, your head of sustainability, and countless others in a matter of days, then both the leadership of those policies, the architecture of how those policies are enforced, but also the the transparency of what is going on Twitter is just not there, other than researchers. So we found, for example, and we talked about this monetization of these sorts of adversarial narratives. We found climate change is a hoax, literally sponsored next by Volvo and by Deloitte, for example. And that sort of pattern is repeated across various different social media platforms. So before Google and YouTube had a policy, before the ads on YouTube, you would have a big brand before a piece of content saying that climate change is a hoax, and that brand is literally paying that person through that platform, but that fortunately no longer happens. So Twitter at the moment is seeing a big uptick in climate change is a hoax because of the narratives coming from Twitter. There is also a lot of groups testing and pushing the boundaries because of the free speech absolutist narratives coming from the leadership of Twitter. So it's a big test. It's also a big test of the ad-funded internet as well, because, like I said, advertisers don't want to be anywhere near this stuff. There's an organization called GARM, which is part of something called the World Federation of Advertisers. So GARM is called the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, who have what they call brand safety floors, where the world's biggest advertisers have all agreed with the tech platforms that they don't want their content next to the worst type of hate speech, the worst type of misinformation about COVID, or indeed climate, exploitation of children, for example. If Twitter cannot get a handle on its enforcement of climate misinformation policy, which they, by the way, don't have on their content moderation policies. Climate misinformation is not specifically called out on Twitter's content moderation policies. If they can't get a handle on that, then we're seeing big brands pull out, and therefore the funding model for Twitter is already in big trouble. So some of the big agency groups, for example, have already pulled all of their clients' money from Twitter and paused it until they know what is going on. So hopefully that answers your question.
I would add that I think all of the tech platforms have struggled with a similar issue. The first is whether or not they should categorize climate misinformation separately to other areas of harm within their broader content moderation practices. And I think the difficulty that a lot of them have faced is that they have felt like there is a clearer, what we might call taxonomy of harm for other types of disinformation. So, if you're spreading extremist hate, it might cause incitement to violence and direct harm against an individual. If you spread COVID-19 misinformation, somebody might falsely inject themselves or ingest a medicine that causes them to end up in hospital. And until now, the companies have kind of used the pretext that there's a lot more abstraction around climate, that you can't necessarily link a piece of active disinformation that calls climate change a scam or, falsely promotes one solution over another to real-world harm. But things like the IPCC report that Jake mentioned at the beginning make that a lot harder now, because it draws a very explicit link. The information environment affects climate action, and climate action is an existential question for humanity. So that taxonomy of harm is now better articulated than it was before. I would also say that many of the companies, I think, have overly fixated on a content-based approach, which means that they've become really wrapped around the axle on trying to legislate on every single individual tweet or post. What is allowed, what isn't allowed, what falls within scope, instead of what we would always advocate, which is looking at systemic issues, the architecture of platforms and how they are optimized for engagement and outrage and incendiary content. And in particular, I really think that going forward, there needs to be a much greater focus on what we would call behaviors and actor-based approaches to dealing with this issue, which is we know that there is a handful of accounts, probably no more than 50 accounts on Meta, 50 accounts on Twitter, all of them verified, that are responsible for either originating or amplifying the vast majority of climate disinformation and discourses of delay. If you dealt with those force multipliers, and we're not talking about removing people from platforms, we're not talking about censorship of free speech, but we're talking about not giving them the biggest megaphones that have ever existed in the history of mankind, and unduly amplifying their content through algorithms and allowing them to monetize it. And you know, if they took that approach, you actually wouldn't need to deal with 100 million data points a day and rely on unpaid, often NGOs and fact checkers to be digging through the morass of content and trying to discern what is and isn't disinformation. Instead, you'd be dealing with the root causes of the problem.
Thanks. And I just highlight as well, the open letter can be found on the website, cad.info. And within that, you can see both the names of the 550 different organizations and individuals who have signed that, but you can also see those asks specifically to the tech platforms, to the UN, UNFCCC, and you can see the definition that's been put together by a coalition of different NGOs from around the world, but also academic input as well. Any last questions? Yeah? Thanks.
Can we name and shame those 50?
I would encourage everybody to read CAD's report that came out in June. It's called Deny, Deceive, Delay, documenting and responding to climate disinformation at COP26 and beyond. And it came out of our efforts last year in Glasgow. And believe me, there is no shortage of naming and shaming. We do profiles on individual high-profile accounts that continue to gain traction. We also look at the key mainstream media outlets at a global level that are responsible for legitimizing this content and platforming bad actors. And we talk about some of the other disinformation outlets that exist within the digital sphere who, again, are creating a veneer of credibility for climate disinformation. So yes, I won't do it here right now, only because we're coming to the end of our time, but it is all very well documented in that report.
Thank you.
Thanks. And that report, as well as other reports that have been put out by coalition partners, can all be also found on the website. And you can also subscribe to the bulletins that the intelligence unit has been putting out throughout COP27, which also goes into more detail about the kind of themes and threats that we've seen, but also some of the actors who have been sharing those. But at that point, I'd like to thank everyone who has joined us today on the platform and those who have come today, but also everyone who's made up the coalition, who have helped to make this work happen, and to all of the organizations and individuals who have signed the open letter. So yes, thank you very much.